But G. Edward Griffin joins us. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and an expert on the private run-for-profit Federal Reserve. And on this day in 1913, we got the, quote, Federal Reserve. That's neither federal or a reserve. And we also got an income tax to pay them and some other things, got rid of the senators being elected by the legislature, so they'd be federal creatures and not state creatures. So the real takeover, if you have to mark one moment of a globalist coup, was 1913. But ever since then, they've been usurping more and more power. So I wanted to get G. Edward Griffin's take on some other news that ties into this, the attacks on free speech, what's happening with the economy. But first, I wanted to get him to break down what this means to him 100 years under this and how far we've come. 20 years ago, almost no one knew it was private. They laugh at you if you said it wasn't federal. Now almost everyone knows it's a sham, and that it's actually they're running things to a great extent outside of Congress. And former head of the Federal Reserve famously told Lair Newshour that, oh, no one can regulate the Fed. It's above government, which, of course, is a total fraud. And now the president says he's above Congress and that the UN is above Congress. So the trampling of our rights is accelerating. And, G. Edward, thank you for coming on with us, and Merry Christmas.
Well, thank you, Alex, and the same to you. I like your introductions because you always take all of the burden off of me. You've just about said everything that I wanted to say.
No, but repeat it in your learned way.
Well, I don't know about that learned part, but, you know, when you think back on the fact that this creature from Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve System, is actually 100 years old, it's appalling to me that the nation has survived it because, as you pointed out, it's a private corporation run for profit. And that's not so bad. I like private corporations run for profit, but I don't like them when they have the power of government behind them and they have the power to coerce me to do what they want to do, or they send me to prison. And that's basically what we have here. We've got a private institution, a cartel, banking cartel, that went into partnership with the government. They took their cartel agreement, which was how they were going to regulate their own industry to their advantage. They took it to Congress, and they got those guys in Washington, D.C. to pass it into law. Now, can you think of more of a coup than that? They took a cartel agreement. Now it's law, so we have to obey it. And I think that that has been in effect now for 100 years, and it's just amazing to me that the nation has survived. Well, of course, now we look back on that and we say, well, it has survived. We're still here. But as Scotty would say on Star Trek, he would say, Captain, I don't think we can hold her together much longer. She's coming apart. You know?
Exactly.
The nation is coming apart, and we can see that. And so it's not a very pleasant picture. It's not a pretty picture at all. But the enlightening thing, or the encouraging thing, I should say, is that people are becoming aware of it now. They're waking up. When I wrote my book, it was back in 1994, nobody knew anything about the Federal Reserve, couldn't care less. Now it's almost a household word. It's in everybody's vocabulary. Maybe not quite so sure what it is, but they know it's big and they know it's bad. They know it's doing bad things. And that's a huge first step toward bringing about reform.
Well said. And your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is available at InfoWarsStore.com to support both of our media organizations and what we're doing. It is so essential for listeners to continue to support the liberty movement, because we couldn't be doing any of this, without the general public support and help. And we've come so far. We've shot down the expansion of the Syria war. We have successfully together exposed the private Federal Reserve. We've beaten their latest gun grabs. Obamacare is incredibly unpopular, which is another private tax to these very same banksters. But more and more, they're just relying on oppressive control. But if the world, not just America, tyranny versus liberty, humanity and the individual versus the collective, establishment, if it was a football game, what's the score right now? Because I feel like we've been down in the game, but we've been rallying, scoring touchdowns, and we're coming up to a tie very soon if we just keep our spirit up and go 110%.
Well, I like that analogy. I don't know that we're coming that close to a tie, that close to it, but we are moving in that direction. That's the important thing. You know, up until a few years ago, I was very depressed about all of this because I thought that, America just didn't care. Well, you know, the truth of the matter is most Americans do care, but they don't understand it enough, and they don't have enough background to know what to do about it. And it's always been that way. It's probably going to always be that kind of a situation where a very small group of people really will always run the show. And we can complain about that. And you can say, well, the elites, we don't like these elites. But the question is, who are the elites going to be? When our nation was founded, thank God it was a very special elite that stepped up to the plate and created this magnificent Constitution that we had. Let's face it, it was created by an elite. The average American at that time didn't have the education, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the foresight, the philosophical background to create a Constitution like that. So the question is not whether or not the masses are really capable of taking control of their own political destiny. The question is, which small group is going to become the leadership group in our society? And this is where I'm encouraged, because I see that little thin margin of the population, which in my view is always less than 3% that runs the show. It's changing. It's changing from the collectivist, the CFR cluster, that center of gravity. And now people like you and myself and others who are in the forefront of calling for freedom and understand what that means, understand what it means to create freedom and what you have to avoid and all that stuff. They have a philosophical base for it. In other words, that group is gradually inching its way. It's like the camel getting its nose under the tent. It's happening, and that's very encouraging to me.
Well, you're right. And again, it's always a tiny minority, for good or bad, that governs and trailblazes. And the establishment knows that. That's why they run collectivist and fascist and control freaks and criminals for office and get them into the police and get them in as mayor, because they crave it. Those of us that crave liberty and crave the animating contest of freedom and who crave truly being free and not dominated, it's our fault that we've ever let these lesser scum run things. Because if you really look at the government types and even the corporate centralized types, they're not that smart. They just have an instinct and a will to power. We have to have a will to take control of the power structure, to empower humanity and to turn humanity loose, like Bruce Fine, who I had on earlier, who at the FCC pointed out, hey, this rule is dictatorial, saying no free speech. Let's just remove it. We never had the authority to begin with, and then we had talk radio out of one guy, because I've studied it, who made a noise at the right time in the mid-'80s. And again, this is an example of how the elite are scared of protest and action and free speech and libertarians, because they know they're a tiny group that took over. They're scared of us. They call us counter-revolutionaries because we want to restore the republic. They're trying to restore kleptocratic gang government.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. And so I think that the collectivist mentality is that you're certainly right, no smarter than anybody else, and in some cases I think they come up short on that side, but they're certainly not stupid, and they understand human psychology, and I think they understand a bit of history that most of us in the past missed, and that is, and you mentioned it, is that there are power centers in society, and whoever controls those power centers controls the whole mass of society. It's not done through one person or one committee that dominates the whole nation. People belong to groups and organizations. They belong to political parties, labor unions. They belong to church organizations, PTAs, and all this sort of thing. They follow leaders, in other words. And if it's possible, and our opponents understood this, it is possible to capture control of the tops of these power centers, these organizations, with a relatively small number of people, if they know what they're doing and are willing to go out and reach for that power. Well, they've been more than willing to reach for that power because it fits their mentality. They're control freaks. They know that power is necessary to control. Those of us who don't want to be controlled have always said, oh, I don't want to get involved in politics. Politics is dirty. I don't like politicians. And we back away from the battlefield. We've never been out there to confront these people. They've had an easy time of it because of our instincts to stay away from power. Well, all of that has got to change, and it is changing. And thanks a lot to you, Alex.
No, my friend, it's thanks to all our listeners and you and so many others. We're in this together. I do have really a lust for liberty. That's not the right word, but a real drive to be free. And we like free association. We want to hang out with our friends. We like people that are successful and artists and who've built their own thing. We know how to build our own system. We are self-sufficient. And so we don't want to be part of the gang. We don't want to go be part of the street gang or the motorcycle gang or the government gang. And so I really think it is gang mentality people versus individuals. So how do lone wolves, how do we then collectively come together to counter a collective?
Well, we have to recognize exactly this issue. We have to know the difference between collective action and collectivism. People get that confused. They think that because you don't want to be part of collectivism, you know that's bad. That's the basis of most of the evils in governments around the world today. They think that therefore you can't cooperate with anybody voluntarily. And I've always answered that by saying just because I'm an individualist doesn't mean I have to move my piano all alone. There's a difference between collectivism and collective action is this. Collective action is done voluntarily. Collectivism is collective action done under the whip. You do it, or you go to prison, or you die. And there's the difference. It's the difference between freedom of choice, the difference between freedom and slavery. Collectivists take advantage of that confusion. They think, well, you can't get this done. See, they love that confusion. Well, and that's why I brought it up, because you can say it so much more eloquently than I can. That's it. Individuals think we've got to be totally alone. No, it's the opposite. We have to get past that instinct to not want to mess with other people and tell other folks that we're right and they're wrong. We've got to do it, or the pea-brains that lust after power are going to dominate us. And so we've got to go out and find other individuals and through free association resist them at every front. And a lot of that is just shopping with Made in America or local or groups that promote liberty. Or using the boycott power, which we're doing more and more. That's why the collectivists are always trying to organize their people into the same thing, when the truth is they're a minority when it comes to actual thinkers. Most of their minions, the camp followers, do it because of a perception of power being part of the group or because of some of the largesse they get. Yes, and then there's a herd instinct, you know. And again, our opponents are very wise. They've studied this psychological element of mankind, and they know how to use herd instinct. And we have to learn how to use that, too. It doesn't mean we have to use it against people or deceive them, but we have to recognize that it's real. People do like to follow leaders, and so we're not going to change that. Even leaders like to follow leaders. I've observed this. You go to a cocktail party, and it doesn't take long before you realize that there's one person generally dominating the room in a cocktail party, and if another one shows up, and he's a dominant person, or she, all of a sudden you got a little contest there between these two dominant ones, and then usually one will back down and yield to the other one. You see it in all segments of the animal kingdom. I remember when I was a kid, I was a city kid, and I fortunately had a couple of summers on my uncle's farm, and one of my chores, so-called, was to go to bring the cattle in, you know, and I noticed at this young age that these cattle always followed the same lead cow. It was always the same lead cow. And one day, the lead cow was kept in the barn for a couple of days because it had an ulcer on the ear, and the veterinarian came out, and he wanted to isolate the cow and all that sort of thing. So the first day, that particular day, the lead cow wasn't in the field, and the other cows were very, very bewildered for a minute, but it didn't take long. Another Bessie moved to the front, and she became the lead cow for the next 2 or 3 days. She was the same lead cow, and then when the other one came back, well, that took over again. And I never really fully understood that lesson until I was much older, and I realized, well, humans are a lot like that too. And so you can fight it, you can bemoan it, but that's the way it is. So it's our responsibility to provide responsible, intelligent leadership for those who want to follow. It's our obligation, really, to provide that kind of leadership, because if we don't, our enemies will, and they're going to lead us right into the prison camp. I agree. And again, I don't like going to cocktail parties for that reason, big ones, because it's all a big show-off fest. I like to hang around with my buddies, and then I shut up and hear them all tell jokes, and then it comes around to me and I make a joke, and that's what I like. I can't, that's the problem, is I want to be alone or hanging out with my wife and kids or with a few buddies fishing or a few buddies, over dinner, and I just don't understand it. But you're absolutely right. And that's why the system, when we stand up as individuals, is we don't want to be slaves and say, hey, I'm not your slave, leave me alone. They're like, how dare you, you're bad, to try to beat you over the head, so all the other followers see that and think, I better not be like that. I better not have free speech like Phil Robinson. I better shut up
because they are trying to take out any lead cow that tries to get off the reservation. What do you make of the state of the open tyranny of Obama? I mean, worse than I thought it would even be, and the open attacks on free speech. I mean, what do you think's really behind that right now, G. Ever Griffin?
Boy, that's a question I'm almost afraid to even think about, and I have avoided it as much as possible, because every time I turn my mind to the question of motives, which is always a dangerous and a hard thing to guess what another person's motives are, I always come up with the bad answer. I keep coming up with a very strong suspicion, at least, that maybe Obama's mission was to lead the country down. I can't imagine that just an ideologue, somebody who really believed in collectivism, somebody who had been indoctrinated into communism and surrounded by a bunch of comrades and so forth, who really believed that from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. In other words, an idealist. It's hard for me to accept that an idealist, once they're put into the seat of power like Obama is, and they could really see up close and personal that these policies are not working at all. In fact, they're accomplishing just the opposite. It's hard for me to imagine that they don't just say, hey, I give up, I was wrong. But no, it just keeps going forward and forward and forward. And I have a suspicion that some of the quotations we've heard from Obama in his early days, before he even went into politics, that about his animosity toward America, his desire to punish and discipline America, I keep thinking, is that really his motive, his purpose, and his mission? And I suspect that it is.
I agree with you, and the folks that run him are like that. It was like the famous actor Ron Silver reportedly in front of newspaper reporters when Clinton was being sworn in back in 1993, and they had jets flying over, and the average rich Hollywood person they were part of the elite, didn't get that military work for them, and looked at Hillary and said, how dare them fly jets over to threaten us, because they knew the average military person wasn't an elitist, decadent scumbag. And Hillary looked at him and said, Ron, those are our jets now. And the thing is that their instinct to run us into the ground and really just do evil things and dominate us. They're threatened by the idea that we could bring them to justice. We could kick the Federal Reserve out. But if they could just break the country like Cloward and Piven, if they could just bankrupt us, then the whole country could become a giant re-education camp, and then they could build their utopia. And I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. And we have to go back to the philosophy of the Fabian socialists. Their idea, and they're still very real, by the way, and very dominant, and not just in the UK. But the Fabian socialist concept was that you had to smash the earth to bits so that you could remold it, rebuild it to your desire. They took that famous line out of Omar Khayyam, that if we could smash the earth to bit and then remold it closest to the heart's desire, that was that famous line. And they even had a mural to that effect, a little stained glass mural in their Fabian socialist house there in England, showing the early members of the Fabian Society with hammers, and they're striking the earth, which is on an anvil, and they're smashing the earth to bits. And to illustrate this idea that if you want to build something new, you have to break the old first. Lenin said it this way. Lenin said, if you want to create an omelet, you have to crack a few eggs, this sort of thing. It's the mentality of all collectivists.
Absolutely, and it's really about them playing God. But we see wherever they get control, they don't build something back beautiful afterwards. They just wreck everything, and then they rule from some smoldering North Korean command center. In closing, what do you want to say about the 100 years of the Federal Reserve and the income tax that came with it, and where do you think it's going?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is we're not going to let it happen for another 100 years, but then it couldn't possibly, because these forces cannot continue that much longer. We're coming to a head. It's not 100 years from now. It's either going to be a lot better or a lot worse. And I think because of what we are doing, it's going to be a lot better. When people become finally aware, not only that things are bad, but why they're bad. And it's not just the people. It's not just people with names, although that's a part of it. You can't ignore it. It's what they believe. It's what they hold in their minds. It's their philosophy, their ideology. Because if we just think it's people, if we just think it's Republicans or Democrats, or if we just think it's Obama or Clinton or some Republican, name anybody. If we think it's that person, then we replace them with somebody just like it, and we haven't gone anywhere. And so we have to realize it's what they believe. And the enemy, really, of freedom around the world is called collectivism. And that's our enemy. And you and I are part of the same crusade to destroy collectivism and replace it with individualism and freedom.
RealityZone.com, G. Edward Griffin, creature from the Jekyll Island, author, available at InfoWarsStore.com. All I know is we stood on the right side of history, and it's been great knowing people like you who have liberty burning in their hearts and minds, and it's our job, as Thomas Jefferson said, to light fires in the minds of men and women everywhere. Have a great New Year, G. Edward. We'll talk to you soon.
Right, bye.
All right, we'll be back with your phone calls, the news, and more on this special transmission.